Hey, what's going on everyone? Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today, we're going to be replacing this oil pan gasket on this F80 M3 in the lift behind us. So, you know what, it's an old joke, a joke is old as time, but the fact of the matter is, you cannot name a more iconic duo than BMW and oil leak. Just seems to be a thing that happens. This particular oil pan gasket is shared with the N55 engine. That engine also has an oil leakage problem after a sustained period of time. The biggest problem on these gaskets is it has a inner sealing portion and it has this rubber outer portion. The innermost edge will become brittle over time. That'll cause the seal to essentially fail, and then oil leaks past that point. Not really a time frame on this. I think it's really just more how many heat cycles the car has gone through. But basically, the only way to do this job is to lower the subframe, which is what all these bolts are for, disconnect the steering column, all of that kind of stuff. It is a pretty involved job, but quite frankly, nobody likes a BMW that's leaking oil onto the ground or a BMW that's not able to contain its oil within the engine. So we're gonna go ahead and fix that today. But before we jump into this job, let's talk about some of the tools you need to do it, and then we can go ahead and get started. So some of the tools you need to do this job, if you ever worked on a BMW before, a lot of these sizes are not gonna be shocking. E10, E12, E14 Torx. You'll need a T25, T30, T40 Torx, along with an 8mm, 10mm, 13mm, 16mm, and an 18mm 6-point socket, and as well as a 21mm socket in 6-point. Some impact, some non-impact. In this case, we do have some impact tools that makes the job obviously super easy, nice to have. Varying ratchets, 18mm wrench, 21mm wrench. Again, very common BMW size. If you've worked on one before. A lot of torque angles on this car, so you have access to torque wrenches that can do torque angles. It'd be super useful. Of course, you can use a regular mechanical torque angle gauge if you don't have access to that. Varying extensions, but really for how big this job is, not really that much in terms of tools. The one special tool you will need is this tow hook, which is not the same tow hook that comes with the F chassis cars. It actually comes from the E chassis cars. Totally different thread pitch in the cylinder head, but we'll provide you the part number for that. Past that, since the hood will be open, you do need to support the engine. Not bad to have one of these safety clamps that goes on the hood lift support. Prevents the hood from ever having the opportunity to fall down. If it were to fall down, obviously it could get damaged, so that prevents that from happening at all. Along with the 86mm 14 flute oil filter housing socket or wrench, cap wrench, whatever you like to call it, that's gonna make it super easy as well to get that oil filter out. But past that, just a general assortment of tools. And with that said, let's get into it. So our first steps in doing this is to get the engine supporter for the top, so we're using an engine support bar for that. And I'm also going to crack the oil filter housing loose to let oil drain out. But first, because the hood's gonna be open, I like to use these hood support clamps to make sure that the hood can't possibly fall down on top of the engine support bar, which, you know, would obviously bend and damage the hood, and we don't want that. I'm gonna take the engine cover off, move this out of the way. And then our engine support hook is going to thread into the top of the cylinder head here. This is not the same as the tow hook that's in your trunk. We will give you the part number for this. It's actually from an older generation of BMW. So now we're just dropping our engine support bar. I'm going to use a 2-post version today instead of a 3-post. Since we're not doing any major work where the engine's going to be jostled, I don't feel the need to set up the 3-post version. But you just want to make sure that's centered. You want to make sure it's sitting on the frame rail of the vehicle, which is the structural portion. And then obviously, once it's in position, we're going to hook the engine to the support bar like so. And this is going to support the engine once we drop the subframe, because again, you got to pull the subframe out to do this job. And once we have tension on this, we'll just make sure that it can't move and it's solidly in place. From here, we'll crack the oil filter cap and loosen our oil filter housing. I'm not gonna remove the oil filter housing cover entirely. I'm just gonna crack it so that oil can drain out of it a little bit more easily. Like so. Now we're gonna lift the car up and drain the oil. 17mm socket for the oil drain plug. While the oil was draining, I took the wheels off, and that's because I do have to unbolt the suspension, control arm specifically, from the subframe, and with the weight of the wheel and tire combination on the outside, that's going to make that very cumbersome to move around and manipulate, so it's just easier if those wheels are off. Oil is still draining out, but we're dropping the oil pan, so it does not all need to come out. We have a new drain plug that we'll be installing later along with the crush washer, but for now, just to stop this dribble so we can continue working, I'm going to go ahead and put the drain plug back in. And you know, we can already see the evidence of an oil leak here. It's pretty clear. So I'll go ahead and just wipe this down right now while I'm here. We'll give everything a nice cleaning once it's kind of all apart, but there is an oil leak, and that is for sure. All right, we're going to start removing some of our undercar shields here. All the stuff has to come out of the way. Start from the front, work our way back. All these are held in with 8mm self-tapping screws. Classic standard from BMW. It goes without saying that a lot of debris gets trapped up under here, so if you're working on your back underneath the car, wear some safety glasses. Stuff will start to fall out once you loosen up these splash shields, so just be prepared for that. We need to remove our oil cooler from the front here, the oil cooler cover. There's a 12mm bolt over here and a 13mm bolt over here. BMW doesn't use 12mm anything, so someone's obviously been in here and lost a bolt and just replaced it with what I would only imagine to be a JS standard bolt instead of a DIN standard bolt. And these pieces here are notorious for breaking. Actually, I think I just found what that piece was from. Sure did. That was already broken off because it was missing those screws. But yeah, these parts right here are notorious on these cars for breaking. There's metal aftermarket ones that help protect the oil cooler. And actually looking at it, that is bent. So that's already taken an impact. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our reinforcement plate. It's held on with 16mm bolts. And if you happen to be working on a car that's missing this plate, replace it. It's a reinforcement plate for the subframe. It actually does do something. In fact, BMW says not to drive the car if this is missing. Now we're going to hold on to the plate because I'm taking the last bolt out. Oh, yeah. First, I'm going to remove the headlight level sensor arm, which is only going to be on the left side of the car. Do need to counter hold the back of the stud that comes through the control arm. Just using these adjustable plier wrenches here. I believe the counter hold is 9mm or 8mm. And now we're going to undo our sway bar link to the sway bar. It's going to be a T30 and a 16mm. So the T30 is the counter hold, and then a 16mm wrench. We're going to remove the control arms of the subframe. And these are tight as frig. Splash shields on splash shields on splash shields. That's every modern car. There's more plastic you have to remove. It's blocking the bolt, just two 8mm self-tapping screws. So I actually did not remove all the splash shields. Oops. So we use a 21mm box wrench and a T40 Torx for the counter hold. We need to loosen the nut for our tie rod. And super important on these, we don't want the ball joint stud to spin. We just want it to stay in position. A lot of these newer BMWs, they don't use tapered ball joint studs, so the studs actually don't seize in the knuckle. But they do have a locking mechanism on the ball joint seat, which is sort of like a sphere. It's got a couple of dimples that sort of bite into the aluminum knuckle. We don't want that to spin and gall up the knuckle, so it's very important that you just spin the nut and not the stud at the same time. So these little dimples here on this seat physically make imprints on the knuckle, and you really don't want to spin this. You need the stud to stay totally stationary. So super important that you hold that counter hold, because once that nut breaks free, it'll start to spin the stud of the ball joint, and it'll absolutely tear that up. In order to get our tension strut bolt out, we're going to have to loosen up our auxiliary coolers here, both on the passenger and driver side. But I'm going to go ahead and loosen everything up on the passenger side first. and then I'll come back to loosen up these coolers to get that bolt out. In order to get the tension strut bolts out, we need to loosen the auxiliary coolers. To do that, we need the splash shields out of the way, and then also to lower the subframe, we have to have the splash shields out of the way as well, because one of the bolts is blocked by them. So we're gonna pull the splash shields out. It's a bunch of 8mm self-tappers, 10mm plastic nuts. There's one T30, then we have a couple of these expanding rivets. So just a bunch of fasteners, really. We're gonna start here at the front fender liner. So you can see right here, this gives us access to the oil cooler and its mount. It's just simply a matter of unbolting it, and then that'll give us enough wiggle room. So it's not a huge deal, but this does have to come off. And like I said, this rear one also has to come off because one of the subframe bolts is there. Also, I'll refer to this as a modern car problem. These things are very tightly packaged. It's not a bad idea to take the splash shields, aero shields, really any of the stuff off at some point, just to clean out the fender liners. You'll be amazed at the amount of debris that builds up inside of there. So you'll get leaves, dirt, you name it. Particularly when you have coolers like this, or vehicles that have both a radiator for your intercooler and a radiator for the engine, it is important to make sure that air flows through this stuff. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to periodically take this stuff out and give it a good cleaning. We're gonna remove our little expanding rivet here. This holds the bracket to that cooling duct, and then we have two T30s here. And then at the top of the cooler, we have another T30. And now we have some wiggle room to get our subframe bolt out. We'll also go ahead and kind of clean the duct out and also clean this auxiliary cooler at the same time. So all of that to get our tension strut bolt out. Going to reinstall that upper bolt and just leave the cooler hanging. Because obviously we're gonna have to have that out of the way when we put the new subframe bolt in. And now we're just gonna go ahead and do the same thing on the right side of the car. It's pretty much just a mirrored image, so 3 T30s in total. All right, so we're moving right along here. Now we're at the point where we can start to disconnect our steering. We're gonna go ahead and remove the steering shaft. It's or the steering shaft from the steering rack. It is a E10. Next up, I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect our connectors here at the steering rack. Next up, we're gonna go ahead and release the power steering harness from the subframe. And we're gonna lower the subframe, and I want this being pulled down for obvious reasons. So we're just gonna unhook it from where it's supported on the subframe. At the front of the subframe here, we have an oil cooler hose that we wanna go ahead and do the same thing to. Just pull the clip out that hooks it. And then what I like to do is I'll just run my hand across the top here to make sure that we don't have anything else that's connected here. Doesn't appear to be so. So we're good on that front. Need to remove this 13mm bolt here. It actually is where the subframe meets the front portion of the primary crash structure. So we'll go ahead and remove this bolt. Of course, the oil cooler, or this auxiliary cooler, is once again in the way. Sort of a common theme on this car. And the other option here too for lowering the subframe, you could just undo the ball joints for the control arms at the knuckle, but that does add a lot of extra weight to the outside. Keeping the subframe a little bit more compact to just its basic components is gonna make it easier to lower this, and you don't have to worry about a balance issue. Also, the extra weight on the knuckles kind of helps keep this out of the way. So it's my personal preference. Do the same thing on this side. We have 6 engine mount bolts, 3 each side. These are also going to be E10s. First, I'm going to remove the 18mm bolts here in the back. This is going to be the one towards the inside. Now we're going to come here to the outside. It's going to be an E14 Torx. We're going to move here forward. Same size, E14. And then we have our most forward subframe mount bolts. So from here, we can start to lower the subframe. I do have those bolts in the back, and the reason I left those in is I want to make sure that this is going to lower evenly, that nothing's caught up on it, and that's just going to provide a little bit of support in the back. Once I know the subframe is free, the steering shaft has come off the steering rack, and nothing else is hung up on the subframe, I can then just go ahead and support it from the back and lower it down in one shot. And the subframe's all aluminum, so it is pretty light. So I don't foresee any problems on that front. The steering shaft and the input shaft on the steering rack had quite a bit of corrosion on it, so that steering coupler did not want to come off. I had to hit it with an extension with a hammer just to get it going. Normally they slip off, but you know, just super tight on those threads for whatever reason because of that corrosion. So at this point, everything should be loose. I'm just gonna hold on the subframe and start lowering it down. We're getting closer to removing the oil pan. However, on the left side, we do have several components that are in the way. Number one, we have our transcooler thermostat right here, which is bolted to the side of the oil pan. We also have some transcooler lines that are bolted to the side of the oil pan. These are E10s here that hold this transcooler thermostat in place. And we have another bracket up here along the side of the oil pan where the transcooler lines attach. Need that out of the way. Now at this point, you can see our transcooler lines are moving freely, which is what we want. So looking at this, I don't think this bracket has to come out. The oil pan should be able to slip out. Should have enough room to come this way and clear that. So if I don't have to remove that engine mount bracket, I'm not going to, because there's other stuff that is connected to the bracket. And if I don't have to disturb any of that, that would actually kind of be a big win. So I'm gonna leave that alone for now. Worst case scenario, if I do have to remove it, we can do that. But I'm gonna leave it alone for now. I think it's doable. And that is only because I have these swivel extensions with the E-Torx built into it. That's kind of the saving grace here. A couple of the bell housing bolts go into the oil pan. We got one here, here, and all the way up there. These need to come out. Also, this holds the oxygen sensor brackets here in the back, so that'll dangle after we remove them. But again, these are going to be E10s, and we're gonna go ahead and remove them. And then our last E10 bell housing bolt is here. Again, this goes directly into the oil pan, so don't want to forget these bolts, because if you try to drop the oil pan with that in there, you're gonna have a bad time. And since we're here in the area, since we're in the vicinity, it would also now make sense to disconnect our oil level sensor. Okay, now at this point, we're gonna go ahead and remove our oil pan bolts here on this side. Make sure that I can get those bolts out. These are E12s. If I can get those bolts out, or those screws out, with the engine mount bracket in the way, leave the engine mount bracket in. So I was able to get those two bolts out behind the engine support bracket. Getting them back in later on is gonna be a tight squeeze, but I think I'll be able to do it. So I'm gonna go ahead and proceed with this route here. Now it's just a matter of taking all the E12s out, and then we should be able to get the oil pan out. And these are all aluminum screws, and they're all torque to yield. So I'm gonna tell you right now, you're gonna have a great time installing all these bolts later on, and torque angling them, and all that stuff. So the only thing holding us up is the engine mount itself. Not the bracket, the little engine mount. So 60mm nut. We'll just plop this off to the side. Our oil pan gasket is pretty cooked on. Now we need to peel it off. This isn't as crusty as I thought it would be, but it's definitely pretty hard in a couple spots. Very typical of how these gaskets fail. This is obviously the sealing edge on the inside, and sort of kind of on the outside, but really this is the sealing edge, and once this stuff becomes brittle, like, it's not gonna seal. And mostly your biggest problem, this is obviously the hot side of the engine. We have our catalytic converters, turbos, there's a whole bunch going on over here. This is where the heat is really going to build up, and this is where we typically see leaks, is usually on the exhaust side. Now, it's not to say they can't leak in other places, it certainly can, but at this point I'm going to go around the perimeter of the engine block here. I'm going to make sure that none of this gas material is stuck to it, so I'm going to use a plastic razor blade. Give it a nice cleaning, clean the oil pan, and kind of just generally get everything prepped to put the oil pan back on. So I'm using some zip ties to keep the oil pan in place and aligned, because we do need to wiggle this around a little bit. Once I have a couple of bolts located in the oil pan in a couple different spots, I'll be able to cut those zip ties off, and we'll move forward. So at this point, our oil pan is lined up, oil pan gasket's lined up. We're gonna go ahead and start installing all the bolts. A majority of these are gonna be our short bolts. There's 2 long bolts here in the rear, but what we'll do to make this a little bit easier is provide you a diagram of where the bolts go. The oil pan bolt kit is going to come with a bunch of bolts that honestly you end up not needing whatsoever. So we'll give you a roadmap as to how this works on the S55. These aluminum oil pan bolts are torqued in 2 sequences. First it's 8 Newton meters, and then it's 180 degrees. I'm gonna go around the perimeter, starting this one here that I marked in blue, just so I can remember. 8 Newton meters all around, and then we're gonna come back and do 180 degrees of rotation. Now we're gonna go on to step 2, which is gonna be 180 degrees of rotation on all these bolts, and I'm starting with this one here marked in blue, and I will stop on the last one before that. Again, just marking to be able to keep track of where I was and where I started. So the 3 bell housing bolts that go into the oil pan, they're torqued to 4 Newton meters and then 100 degrees. So I'll just torque them first, and then I'll come back and do the torque angle. I'll reinstall the trans-cooler line brackets to the oil pan. Then we have our last trans-cooler line bracket up here at the front. We'll go ahead and reinstall this bolt. Call that good. And then we'll plug in our oil level sensor and make sure that all of our wiring brackets and stuff, everything is secured properly. So at this point, the oil pan has been reinstalled. We still do need to change out the drain plug, crush washer and stuff, but we'll do that a little bit later. That's not a big deal at this point. What I really want to do is thoroughly clean this area of all the oil residue that's still here. So I'm just gonna use some brake parts cleaner, hose it all down, wipe it all down, and that way when the car is being driven again, we can make sure that everything is sealed up properly. We don't want any residual oil to be in the area, because that could potentially be misleading, suggesting that there's still an oil leak even when there isn't. So we have the oil pan reinstalled, went ahead and cleaned down everything, removed as much of the oil that was in this area as possible. As you can see, the oil pan is looking pretty clean. Went ahead and put a new crush washer here on our oil drain plug. Just gonna torque that to 25 Newton meters, which is a pretty standard BMW torque spec for that. So we have that done now. Now I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall our engine mount. And I think it goes without saying that now would be a great time, if you wanted to replace the engine mounts. We're not gonna be doing that here today. These are still in perfectly good shape. Now, I'm gonna leave that nut loose for now, because I need this engine mount to line up with the subframe when we push it back out of position. I will tighten that nut once the subframe is in position. So for now, I'm just gonna leave it so that it can rotate and move a little bit. I just don't wanna create a situation where this thing is in a bind. All right, so before we get too far ahead, we need to make sure that our steering rack is in the steer head position. And we have a marking here, which I've just put a little bit of paint pen marking on there. So as I move this, that's to the right, that's to the left. We have a little line here on this plastic cover, and then we have a little line here on the input here. This is like the torque sensor for the electric steering. Want to make sure that those two are aligned, and that would be in the steer head position. The other thing that we want to do is make sure that the steering wheel in the car is pointed straight ahead. I do believe it is. I'm going to double check. Just looking here at our steering shaft, the open section of this joint is facing vertical and needs to slip over this. So we should be okay on that front. I'm just going to do a quick check up there to make sure that it is in fact aligned. As I push this subframe up into position, I want to make sure that the steering shaft aligns onto the input shaft here on the steering rack. And as long as that steering wheel is straight on the inside of the car and the steering rack is in the straight ahead position, steering will be just as it was before. So we need to now push the subframe up into position, and we need to be aware of a couple things. Number one, the front of the subframe here has to slide into these notches here. I did thread the bolts back in that support the front of the subframe to these notches, so I pulled those out. Also, we need to make sure the steering shaft ends up engaging properly with our steering rack. We need to make sure the engine mounts line up, and we also need to make sure that all the bolt holes line up. Now you'll see these studs here, or these pilots or dowels here in the front of the subframe. Those need to line up with these holes here, and this is what aligns and squares the subframe to the chassis of the car. Super important to make sure that these bottom out properly first. And then our torquing sequence for all the subframe bolts is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we're working from our front and then out. So with that said, let's get this up in position. Nice thing is it's aluminum, so it's light and it's very well balanced. Truthfully, I probably could have left the control arms attached, but like I said, you could do this two different ways. It's not a big deal one way or the other. So right now I'm just getting the front subframe bolts in. These are the M12 by 1.5 by 45 bolts. And I'm also using it to help draw the subframe down to the frame rails. It's important to make sure that these holes are lining up out here. If they're not lining up, or there's any kind of misalignment anywhere within how the subframe is going into position, obviously you'll need to maneuver it. And you shouldn't have to fight it or force it. It's really, really important that you make sure the front of the subframe is properly located. And it should self-locate on the dowels. Our second subframe bolts in the middle position, these are the M12 by 145 bolts. So the longest subframe bolt is going to be right here next to the engine mounts. At our rearward position on the frame rail of the car, this is where we use the M14 by 105s, or the big bolts. It's the only M14 bolt used on the subframe. And then our last bolt is an M10 by 40, has a piloted tip like that. And that goes into the outermost position. Just gonna thread in our new engine mount bolts. Just gonna get these started. Now, I have not forgotten about our left engine mount. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten the nut on top here in a second. Just wanna make sure that it's aligned properly. I'm also going to clean the subframe here because it's obviously still kind of oily. So now I'm gonna go ahead and put our new steering shaft pinch bolt back in. It should thread in if everything is aligned. If we need to maneuver it, we will. If the steering shaft is all the way down in position, you should just be able to thread this bolt in by hand up until the Loctite. The tendency on the steering shaft is it won't always come all the way down in position, so you just have to force it so that the joint there is flush with the steering rack. If the screw won't go in, it's because it's probably out of position. It has to go through a notch. So we got that started. At this point, all our subframe bolts are in, and the only other thing I want to get in is these forward bolts here that lock the forward portion of the subframe to this front support. This is where we have to move our auxiliary coolers out of the way to get the bolt in. Again, great packaging from BMW on these cars. Just put a lot of stuff in a very tight area. And again, these should just line right up. So we have these 8 subframe bolts of torque. All 4 of them are different sizes, and all 4 of them have different torque specs. But we have to start here at the front. So this is our main one. This is what centers the subframe on the frame rails. 120 Newton meters. Now I'm going to get the second bolt in line, which is 108 Newton meters. Still an E14. The 18 millimeter here, which is the M14 bolt, this is torqued to 120 Newton meters. And then our rear outer bolts are 56 Newton meters and then 90 degrees. Torque spec on our steering shaft bolt is going to be 24 Newton meters and it's E12. I'm going to get at it from the side here where the subframe is. We're going to go ahead and tighten down our engine mount nut. It's kind of impossible to get a torque wrench in there. It's 56 Newton meters is the spec. Just making sure that it is tight, which that is tight. I feel good about that. We're using the old calibrated wrist on that. Now we're going to torque our engine mount bolts. These are 19 Newton meters E12. Oh. And lastly, we need to bottom out and torque the front of our subframe where it intersects with the front support. 13 millimeter, and we'll torque these to 24 Newton meters. From here, now that all of our bolts have been torqued, I'm going to go ahead and re-secure our power steering electrical lines. Remember, we had to disconnect the harness from the subframe, so we're just going to go ahead and click those back into where they want to go. And then we also have a oil cooler hose up here that we need to clip back into place. We have everything hooked back up, all the critical bolts and things, at least for the subframe, engine mount, all that stuff is good to go. I'm going to use some degreaser here on the subframe, clean that down. The biggest thing here is when we start the engine, want to check for leaks and don't want to be confused with any of this residual that is currently on the subframe. So it's really important to clean everything down when you have the chance, and obviously when it's in this state, that is a lot easier to do. So the way that we lower the subframe here, we need to put the control arms back on the subframe. If you chose to release the ball joint nuts from the knuckle, this might be a little bit different. Both are totally viable options. It's up to you. So really, it's just a matter of getting everything lined back up. Worth mentioning, these control arm bolts are one-time use only. However, this car also needs control arms, which we're going to do in a totally separate video. So I'm not replacing these right now because that does not make sense since we're going to replace them. But worth mentioning, if you choose to release the control arm for the subframe, you have to replace this hardware. If you choose to release it from the knuckle, you have to replace that hardware. So no matter what, you're replacing some hardware somewhere. Our headlight level sensor arm, which I had hooked up here to the sway bar link. You'll notice this bracket. This bracket has a notch. That notch lines up with a notch on the subframe, and it goes together like that. Helps to have a friend to hold the cooler out of the way while you get the control arm back into place. Lastly, we just need to get our tie rod into our knuckle. And then we'll pop our sway bar link back into the sway bar. And then basically we just need to do the same thing on the other side. We'll torque all these bolts down here in a minute, but really need to get both sides situated before we can do that. Using a T30 socket and a 16 millimeter wrench, I'm going to start to tighten down our sway bar link nut. The T30 is the counter hold, And then the torque spec for that 16 millimeter nut will be 56 Newton meters. $18 millimeters for our wishbone here. And then torque spec on this bolt is going to be 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Because this has a sealed monoball on the inside, we don't need to torque this at ride height. So similar situation here, we need to install a new tie rod nut. It's 21 millimeter with a T40 counter hold. Very important that the stud does not spin. So we start the long painful dance of tightening this nut down. And then torque spec on this tie rod nut will be 175 Newton meters, which is a whole heck of a lot. And we'll also make sure that we tighten down our headlight level sensor rod. 10 Newton meters will be the torque spec for this if you want to do that. I'm not going to, it's not a critical component there. Tight is fine. Torque spec's 175 Newton meters. I'm using a long 1/2 inch extension to get down on top of the nut. There we go. And now I'll just do the same on the other side. So at this point, it's just a matter of putting all of the splash shields back into the car, making sure that our auxiliary coolers are reinstalled with brackets. So I'm gonna do this first. Remember, we took these brackets off before. It's held in by a couple of T30s. Want to make sure that this is properly supported and secured before we put any of the other liners back in place. But all the fender liners are held in with 8 millimeter self-tapping screws and a couple of 10 millimeter plastic screws in the case of your fender liners. But I mean, this is pretty much a straightforward operation going back together at this point. If you've made it this far, I think you'll be able to figure out how to put a lot of these shields back underneath the car. I hope so. I hope I figure it out. All right, went ahead and cleaned up our reinforcement plate here. This thing was caked with oil and dirt, if you remember from earlier when we took it apart. Now we're just gonna go ahead and push this up into position. And the orientation on this, we have to obviously have the opening here for the oil pan. So as you can kind of see, it sort of splays out this way. The wider portion is going to be towards the rear. Our axle or subframe reinforcement bolts are 56 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. I'll do the 56 first and then the 90 second. So I finished everything down below. You know, something like 100 self-tapping screws later, it seemed like, and several panels. Only thing that we have left to do at this point is change the oil filter and refill the engine with oil. And then we will start the car and we'll make sure that there's no leaks. Now, BMW does recommend to do a priming procedure on an engine after these types of repairs. We have a video that talks about that at depth, so go watch that. We'll do something similar here, but that video covers the general gist of why it's important and why you should do it. Along with the oil filter kit, we got this little green O-ring that we need to replace. That actually seals the oil filter housing cover to the bottom of the oil filter housing. That's basically blocks the drain back. So I want to make sure that that O-ring seal is oil tight. Definitely don't want oil bypassing the oil filter and draining back to the bottom of the engine. Slide our new O-ring on. There's a groove for the O-ring here in the filter cover. Needs to go in that groove, not up against this flat seat where the cover threads into the filter housing. I've seen that mistake done a couple times. It won't leak per se, but it could leak eventually, and you normally won't catch it until bad things have happened. Slide this new O-ring over. There we go. Just need to lightly lubricate that O-ring. Plop the filter back on. Now, the torque spec for the filter cover is 25 Newton meters. Just did it with my hands, but curious to see how close we are. The point is, these are often over torqued or over tightened. The O-ring is what does the seal, just like on any oil filter. There is absolutely no need to over tighten that. Reasonably close. And for the oil fill here, we're using Liquid Moly Special Tech 5W30. It's Long Life 1 compatible. Any Long Life 1 or Long Life 1 FE oil is fine for the S55 engine. Put about 6.5 liters of oil in here. Now I did drop the oil pan, but did not remove any residual oil from inside the oil pan. So effectively, I didn't do anything more than just a really, really complicated oil change on this car. So didn't open up the oiling circuit at all. So what would normally be put back in this car during an oil change is what's going back in it. So 6.5 liters of oil, that's where we're gonna start. We'll run the car and we will top off as needed. All right, so that's how you go about replacing an oil pan gasket on an F80 M3. Of course, this is gonna be a very similar process, if not an identical process, on an F82 or F83 M4 or an F87 M2 or M2 comp with the S55. Realistically, the most difficult part of this job is gonna be lowering the subframe and supporting the engine. As long as you have the appropriate tools for that, along with an adequate workspace, it's really not that bad. Definitely the second most difficult part would be torquing all those oil pan bolts, since there's many of them and they're all torque angles, so that does take some time. But past that, getting the subframe line back up and everything else, pretty straightforward, all sort of typical standard BMW stuff. But if one of your BMWs is having this problem and you have an S55 engine, you now know how to take care of it on your own. Hope you learned a lot of this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit the like button. And of course, hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. And as always, I'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.